Hello, anyone out there? Well, this is our second evening of telling spooky stories, so I hope we got some viewers out there. Here I am in the Highlands. We're going to skip the fireplace tonight. Last Friday night when I did the fireplace, it was roasting, so we're not going to have the atmosphere tonight. But hey, I see Laura and Suzanne and Mitzi, Charles. Hi, everyone. Hi, Mike. So as you're checking in, let people know where you're from. But it's time to get the bourbon, so I'm going to go into the next room and get my bourbon. So follow me. Doing Old Forester tonight, the bourbon of Louisville. So everyone make sure you say what bourbon you're drinking tonight. And like I said, we're not going to go into the living room. We're not going to be in front of the fireplace, but we're going to go inside my magic library tonight. So I don't know if you knew this, but in my living room, there's like a little secret door. See that door back there? It's kind of hidden in the wall. You open it up, and you got my magic library. So this is where we're going to do my stories tonight. So this is where I like to hang out and do my writing. It's got all kinds of mismatched, beat up furniture, some of my favorite stuff. It's a good place to write, a good place to tell stories. So let's get situated. If you're just checking in, make sure you let people know where you're from, please, okay? So hang on one second while I get us connected. Let me see how we're going to do this. All right, and I figured out how to do the Facebook thing where it's not in reverse. So you should be able to see titles and things tonight the right way on. So what's everyone drinking? Old Forester, good. Oh, hey, Allie, how's it going? There's Mr. Calhoun, how's it going? Mr. Smith, good to see you all. There's Beth. So like I said, if you're just checking in, make sure you let you know where people, where you're from. Say what city, what state. Maybe we got some out-of-country people tonight. And let people know what you're drinking. Like I said, I'm doing Old Forester tonight, the bourbon of Louisville. So cheers. We're going to go ahead and get started. But just to recap, since things are kind of dead in the tour business, I'm not out every night telling. And I got my Corona hair. I don't know which way it's supposed to go. Okay. Normally I'd be out telling stories and showing off the neighborhood, but with the current situation we can't do that. So to kind of keep me on point, remembering some of the stories I tell, and just to help people pass the time, we're going to be telling ghost stories from some of my books. And if you don't know anything about what I've written, my first book, Ghosts of Old Louisville, came out in 2005. 2 years later, I wrote Phantoms of Old Louisville. And a year or two after that, Haunts of Old Louisville. So these three books kind of make up what's called the Ghost of Old Louisville series. And that's kind of how I got into giving tours of the neighborhood. It was a way to promote the neighborhood, because when I moved here back in the 90s, people weren't talking a lot about Old Louisville. So it was kind of me doing my part to get the neighborhood on the map, and started off as a fundraiser to make money for different neighborhood associations and just kind of get the word out. So What happened is several years ago, I took the most popular stories of these three books. I edited and updated them, and I put them in a new volume, kind of a best of collection. That's called True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. And what happened is over the years, people got in touch with me. They said, "Oh, that was my grandmother you wrote about on 6th Street," or "We used to live in that house you wrote about on St. James Court." And they started sending me pictures and death certificates. Sometimes they said, "Oh, you got this part wrong." And so I started correcting things where I'd made mistakes here and there. But mostly it was editing and updating, just adding in more information that substantiated these stories. And so this book, like I said, True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood, came out a couple of years ago. This is kind of the go-to guide. So if you're looking for a book about the hauntings in Old Louisville, this is the most recent one, and this is the one I recommend. So what I'm going to do until the stories run out, I'm going to be telling you some of my favorite stories from this book. So if you didn't see the first episode, that was Friday night, and I told a story about the ghost of Annie Whipple, who haunts the beautiful Louisville Bourbon Inn at the corner of 4th and Park. And then we heard about the Witch's Tree as well, which is one of my favorite stories. And tonight we're going to talk about two other stories that aren't too far away. And so I'll be telling these stories until they run out. I'm thinking about a week or 10 days we'll run out of these stories. And then what I'm going to do is switch to my next book, my very last book, which is called Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa. It's a memoir about the house I used to live in. I saw Sarah Wade just check in. Sarah Wade and Josh Wade, by the way, they bought the house where Ramon and I used to live on 3rd Street, where it all started. So if you see Sarah or Josh Wade on here, say hello. They're the ones living in La Casa Fabulosa right now. But tomorrow night, I think I'm actually going to tell the story of the Widmer house, kind of what happened when I was living there and how I got involved in all of this. Yeah, mi casa, Sarah. And this was a really fun book to write, because what I discovered is it wasn't just the spooky things in the neighborhood that were interesting. It was the real life characters. If you know anything about Old Louisville, there's all kinds of interesting people down there. It makes life really interesting. So once I finish the stories from True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood, then we'll kind of switch over. And I think what I'll do is just kind of read this, like 20 pages every night or something, because I think we're in this for the long haul. So thanks for checking in tonight, and y'all got your bourbon? Yeah, like I said, if you're just checking in, let people know where you're from. And if you got your bourbon in front of you, let people know what your bourbon of choice is. So let's make a toast. Once again, cheers and welcome to the Magic Library. And let's start our first story tonight. So actually, the first story is not really all that scary. It's an interesting story, but on 4th Street, there's a house that is reportedly haunted. And it's at 1438 South 4th Street. It's called the Lady Ross House. And people who live there have reported that on certain nights they will see a shadowy form kind of descending the stairs at the front of the house. This house, which was a single family house, has been turned into apartments. So it's usually like students, because the University of Louisville, with thousands of students, is nearby. But I've talked to students who've rented there over the years, and they've told me a lot of interesting stories about things they've seen in the house. Different things have happened, smells, sights, and sounds, but the one thing all these encounters have in common is they see the shadowy form descend the stairs. And some say it's just kind of a cloudy figure, kind of diaphanous. Other people say it looks to be a woman kind of in a long gray dress or a gown. And often they say it's kind of a dowdy kind of dress, but they always report that they see a string of pearls around this woman's neck. And so what happens is, very often, I talk to these people, and if they seem credible, that's when I start going to the library and the courthouse, pulling up the old property deeds, trying to find out who lived there in the past, and dig up what substantiation I can. And 9 times out of 10, I'll find something very interesting in the past, usually in the historical record, that kind of corroborates what is going on in the modern day as far as these hauntings is concerned. And I made a very interesting discovery about this house that they call the Lady Ross house, but they didn't call it the Lady Ross house back then because no one knew that Lady Ross lived there. So if any of you are fans of Downton Abbey, you know that in the late 1800s, we had the dollar princesses in the United States. It was commonplace for wealthy industrialists to marry off their daughters, usually to impoverished noblemen. The European nobility, they were doing this because they were short on cash. The Americans were doing it because they wanted the prestige. And it happened a lot. Just in Louisville alone, there were 6 different women who married into the European nobility in the very late 1800s and the early 1900s. One of the most famous was a young girl by the name of Patty Burnley Ellison. And she lived in the house I just showed you at 1438 South 4th Street. And she was from a very modest family. It's a very middle-class family by old Louisville standards. What happened is in 1901, Patty had accompanied a wealthy aunt on her grand tour of Europe. And they spent some time in Europe on this crossing, the Atlantic crossing, coming back to the United States. Patty met and fell in love with the wealthiest landowner in Britain at the time. It was a man by the name of Sir Charles Henry Augustus Lockhart Ross, the 9th Baronet of Balnagown, Scotland. And they decided to get married. But there was a problem. They were hoping for a royal wedding, but it turns out Sir Charles, as he was known, had been married before. So they had to settle on a quiet ceremony at the family home on 4th Street. And afterwards, family and friends were in attendance. They went down to the Pendennis Club and had a reception. And then after some time in Louisville, they returned to Europe via Montreal, where they spent a lot of time. And they took up apartments in London. And everyone in this area was thrilled because this was unlike the typical wedding back then between American wealthy families and impoverished noble people. This was a case where the young woman, she didn't really have anything. She was from a very middle-class family. The man she was marrying, he had the title and he had all this money, so people thought this was a match made in heaven. And Lady Ross, as she was known, became something of a local celebrity. She kind of disappeared in Europe for a while, and people just assumed she was having a dream come true and that it was going to be a happy ending. But not too long after, news started trickling back from Europe that Lady Ross wasn't as happy as people thought she would be. And the reason was, if she had done a little more research about her husband, she would have found out that the reason he was divorced in the first place was that he was a terrible womanizer. And he was known to be quite a ladies' man. And so Lady Ross found out rather quickly, but she toughed it out, and they stayed married for 2 decades. She, became accustomed to the title, to the prestige. He kind of went on and did his own thing. Eventually, it erupted in a scandalous divorce in the 1920s. All the newspapers around the globe covered it. The couple's dirty laundry was aired, and they were divorced. And Lady Ross, as she was known, was able to keep her title, and she stayed on in Europe. In World War II and in the years leading up to World War II, she became kind of a foreign correspondent for Louisville newspapers. If she could, she would come back in the summer. She would spend several months with her family, and then she'd go back to Europe, and she always lamented the fact that she wasn't in Louisville. She yearned for the warm, sultry days of the South and the sights and smells, and she always looked back with fondness on her time in Louisville. And she died in 1947. She was buried in London, but she, like I said, was a household name back then. And you can even go back in the old Louisville papers. You can find columns written by her. And here's her byline from one of the columns from the Louisville Courier-Journal, and that's what she looked like. Whenever she came to town, whatever she was wearing kind of set the tone, kind of set the standard for what the women in Louisville would wear. The funny thing is, they found out that she was married in November of 1901, and all these accounts of her ghosts appearing in this house on 4th Street always appear in November. And the dress she wore was kind of dowdy. Not too many years ago, her great niece got in touch with me. Lady Ross's great niece, actually, who lives in Florida, got in touch with me, and she shared some old family photos. It's a not very good picture, but you can kind of see right here. This is the wedding dress she was wearing. It's kind of dowdy. It was gray silk, they said, but she had a big string of pearls around her neck. So what people surmise is that they say the last time Lady Ross knew true happiness was her days in Louisville. So every November she kind of returns to harken back to happy days. And incidentally, the castle where they lived in Scotland, where Lady Ross and her husband, Sir Charles Henry Augustus Lockhart Ross, the 9th Baronet of Balnagon, Scotland, lived until they got divorced, eventually became the place where Dodi Al-Fayed, the owner of Harrods in London, lived. He bought it and restored it. And if you don't know anything, his son was the one that was with Princess Diana in the car when they were killed that night. So it's an actual castle. I'm trying to look for a picture of it. But it was a hunting lodge for a while. Where'd it go? Yeah, kind of hard to see. But this is what the castle at Balnagon looks. How to do this thing? Yeah. So there's Balnagon Castle, still there today. And if you go there, you can take the tour. If you go there, make sure you know that people know that you're from Louisville and that a Louisville lady was partly responsible for all of this. Okay, so like I said, that wasn't a very scary story, but it's an interesting story because there's some real local history. And what I find fascinating about old Louisville is we have all these old houses. They've been around for 130 years, and think about what happened in your own house. You've been there 10, 15, 20 years. Lots of things have happened in a house. So imagine a house that's been around for 120, 130, 140 years. There's all kinds of stories there just waiting to be discovered. So that's what I like to do with my writing, is kind of dig down deep and find out what happened in the past and kind of bring these stories to life and let people know, where we are in Louisville, Kentucky. We have this great neighborhood. We've got tons of great homes and mansions, fascinating architecture, and some of these places are haunted. So now we're going to move on to our next story, which I think is a little creepier. So refresh your bourbon if you don't have your bourbon. By the way, I don't have to worry. I have a flask on hand. I don't have to go back into the dining room. Thanks to my friend Tim Pardue. I was complaining a couple of years ago that flasks were just kind of tiny little hip flasks were worthless. I called them single serving size. So he gave me a present not too long ago, this size flask. So that's the kind of flask you need. So I got my flask all ready to go. So everyone, grab your bourbon, and we're gonna move on to our story about the man from the killing tree, one of my creepier stories from the neighborhood. Okay, so give me a second. I'm gonna sip my bourbon and I'll be right back. All right, we ready to go? All right, like I said, if you're just checking in, yeah, it is a big flask, Sarah. There it is. All right. If you're just joining us, we're getting ready for our scary story, The Man at the Killing Tree. Let people know where you're from, city and state. If you're from out of country, let us know. And VG says Thomas needs one of these. I'll have to ask Tim where he got it from. This is the biggest flask I've seen. Yeah. But yeah, let people know where you're from and let us know what kind of bourbon you're drinking tonight. Okay? So, we're going to move on to our next story, which is the story of the man from the killing tree. And if you've been to Old Louisville, it's a really charming neighborhood. Like I said during our first session on Friday night, what's fascinating about Old Louisville, it's one of the largest historic preservation districts in the country. We have 45 square blocks of old houses. Hey, Muriel. And, okay. I'm supposed to show the ceiling for the Magic Library. Let me give a tour of the Magic Library for those who are just checking in. All right, so this is my Magic Library. So when we started, I got the bourbon and I told people about my secret door here. And behind my secret door, that's where we have the Magic Library. You go in, and I like lights for inspiration for when I'm writing. And it's just a room where I put all my beat up furniture, some of my favorite things. I have a goofy hat collection, so maybe some night I'll put on a goofy hat and wear it. I have my Mexican luchador stuff. I have my coonskin cap. My books and stuff. This is usually where I sit and write. Yeah, so there's the ceiling, yeah. All right. So I did that for Margareta. Abby, I wouldn't be surprised if Balnagown does Scotch whiskey. Yeah. I don't have any Scotch here. It's kind of like you're in bourbon country. It's kind of anathema to do Scotch. All right, hang on a second. Now I got to get another bourbon. All right, so y'all saw my hair. I don't know which way my hair is going. Oh well. Well, I got a fan on because it's kind of warm in here, so the fan's blowing my hair around. Okay, but now we're all ready for... Hey, Jared, how's it going? All right, just trying to read the comments. All right, but are we ready for our Man from the Killing Tree story? One of my favorite stories in the neighborhood. All right, so like I was saying, Old Louisville is a great neighborhood. We've got blocks and blocks of beautiful old houses. Most of these are old houses from the 1880s to 1900, so it's one of the largest Victorian neighborhoods in the country. And you know, when a house has been around for 130, 140 years, it's probably seen some history. And that might be why some of these places are so haunted. It's not just the houses in Old Louisville that are haunted, though. We've got churches that are haunted, and there's public spaces that are haunted as well. Central Park, I'll tell that story a different night, is haunted. And some of our walking courts are haunted. If you don't know what a walking court is, you have to go to Old Louisville to see what a walking court is. So in Old Louisville, and you find these in other parts of the city, walking courts are areas where when designers were laying out the city in the 1890s, or that part of the city I should say, instead of always building the houses in the traditional configuration from the 1800s where they were built facing each other over streets with lots of busy traffic running through them, in certain parts they built the houses so they faced each other over green spaces. So on a walking court, you come out your front door, and instead of a street out in front, you've got a grassy boulevard or a park-like setting. And across the way, you've got your neighbor's front yard. And in certain areas, like Belgravia Court, our most famous of the walking courts, there's gas lights that go 24 hours a day. They're really charming parts, and they really make the neighborhood unique. A lot of people compare the walking courts in Old Louisville to the famous squares in Savannah. And if you haven't heard, they're saying, you know, Savannah, Charleston, places like that are much better known, but they're going to get a run for their money pretty soon because Old Louisville is the next Savannah, the next Charleston in the making. More and more people are discovering this neighborhood and talking more about it. Okay, so hang on a second, I got a comment there. Okay. All right. Well, anyway, one of these walking courts is called Floral Terrace. And Floral Terrace is one of the newer ones. It's from 1905. It's built on the site of a wealthy family's private gardens. Back in the day, what is now Old Louisville was kind of out in the country. And there was a wealthy family, the Duminils, who had a country house out near what is now Central Park. And to the west, they had acres and acres of flowering trees and shrubs. And for years, their private gardens, the Duminil Botanical Gardens, was kind of a local tourist attraction in Louisville. And they moved out in 1905. The land was really desirable back then. The wealthy families were moving out to the countries. They didn't want to be crowded in because everyone was moving to this part of town. And so the Duminils sold their land. A developer snatched it up, decided to put it in one of these walking court neighborhoods because they were so popular. And the houses there date from 1905 to 1910. So these aren't the typical Victorian house that populate what is now most of old Louisville, big mansions from the 1880s, the 1890s. Most of these houses are kind of arts and crafts houses, some of them Dutch barn design with that typical gambrel roof, which is very identifiable. But at the center of Floral Terrace today, which is kind of an undiscovered gem in the neighborhood, a lot of people in the neighborhood live down there for years. They don't even know that this area is there. But there's a fountain at the center, and it kind of trickles away. It's maintained by the neighborhood association, and according to the locals, it's one of the haunted spots in the neighborhood that's outside. And this area is haunted by someone they call the Man from the Killing Tree. So the Man from the Killing Tree is an apparition that they say has been appearing for years, and they say, the apparition of someone who was hung at this location, possibly lynched. So the local lore has it that at the spot where the fountain stands today, there was once a huge cottonwood tree. And back before the area was developed, it was rumored that this cottonwood tree is where a lot of lynchings took place. The thing is, I did research, and there are no documented cases of lynchings in Louisville at the time, or ever. A lot of people don't know this, but back before Jim Crow, Louisville was actually a very progressive city. Back in the 1890s, blacks and whites rode the tram cars together. It wasn't until Jim Crow that segregation set in, things started to change. But in any case, there are no documented cases of lynchings, so people are a little confused as to why there might be a ghost of a man who seems to have been lynched at this tree appearing every now and then. And the people who see this apparition always describe the same thing. It looks like it's a man dangling from the end of a rope. His neck is kind of crooked at an unnatural angle. His eyes are bugged out. His tongue is sticking out. And even though I wasn't able to substantiate any of these claims about lynchings taking place, that doesn't mean it couldn't have happened. Back then they covered things up like that. So if local lore and tradition is any indicator, it could be that at one time lynchings did take place here. But what really got me interested in the story was an encounter I had. I was out walking my dogs one day, and I met this old man. He was in his 90s, and his name was Roscoe. And he lived on Park Street, which is right on the other side of... so Melissa is asking where it is in Old Louisville. It is, so if you're at 6th and 7th Street, and then that would be the east-west boundaries, and then Park and Ormsby Avenue. So where the Witch's Tree is, actually. If you go to where the Witch's Tree is, it's on the corner of the block where Floral Terrace is, okay? So, yeah, what happened is I had a really interesting encounter one day. I was out walking my dogs, and I met this old guy by the name of Roscoe. I'm going to kind of adjust this so you can see the ghost. Ooh, I didn't notice that back there. I'm at my shelf with all the ghosty things. But yeah, I met this guy named Roscoe who had lived in the neighborhood forever. He said he grew up there. He was born in the 20s, and he was one of the few people who was still living in the neighborhood where he grew up. And Roscoe lived in a little kind of, it wasn't a shotgun house, but like a cottage on Park Avenue. And he said growing up, he had always heard about this story, this character, the Man from the Killing Tree. I guess back in the 30s and 40s, if you lived in Old Louisville in that part of town, the man from the Killing Tree was like the neighborhood boogeyman. You know, when the children went out in the morning in the summer, their mother would say, "You better be home by dark, or the man from the Killing Tree is going to get you," or the man from the Hanging Tree. Kind of went back and forth. And so Roscoe, this guy I talked to, he said he had grown up hearing about the man from the Killing Tree, but he never, you know, he never really thought much of it until one night he said he had an encounter. So around the fountain where the man from the Killing Tree is said to appear, there are several benches, and Roscoe said that every night he would kind of come down the back alley. He would sit on one of these wrought iron benches and just sit by the fountain. And that was his evening ritual. He would sit there and listen to the water trickle over the fountain, and then he'd go home and get ready and go to bed. He said one night he was there, it was the end of June, I believe. He said it was unseasonably hot, and he was sitting at the fountain on the wrought iron fence, or I'm sorry, the wrought iron bench. And he said it was really uncanny because it was just a really still night. It was hot and sultry, and there wasn't a single breeze, you know, in the area. But he said all of a sudden he heard something. He heard like a creaking. It sounded like a branch was kind of moving back and forth. And he looked around and he couldn't see any of the branches in the trees moving. If you go to Floral Terrace in the summer, it's beautiful. All the trees have big canopies. It's green. In the daytime, it's always 10, 15 degrees cooler because of this wonderful shade. But he said, despite the sound, there was no wind or anything to explain the sound of a creaking branch. And he said he looked around, and all of a sudden, above the fountain, he noticed a shadowy, shimmery form appeared. And he stood there. He said it was kind of transfixed. And all of a sudden, he said he saw this shape take form, and it looked like a man dangling from the end of a rope. The thing is, he couldn't see the rope, but he could tell from the way the guy was hanging, with his neck kind of crooked at an unnatural angle, his arms down at his side, that it was someone who was hanging from a rope. And the thing is, the creaking that he had heard was kind of corresponding to the creaking that a branch would make under the weight of a body hanging from it at the end of a swinging rope. And when he saw this thing, he said he knew right away what it was. It was the man from the Killing Tree. His eyes were bugged out, his tongue was swollen, stuck out, his neck was crooked at an unnatural angle. Hope you'll appreciate all the extra effects I'm giving tonight. And he knew right away he was seeing the man at the Killing Tree he had grown up hearing stories about. Well, he didn't want anything to do with this, so he got up and he ran home, and he decided he'd never come back to that bench by the fountain. So he had some warm milk or something, whatever he did to kind of calm down. And an hour later, he just kind of shook it off. He decided, he had had some strange experience and he'd never go back to that area. But he went to the bathroom and started to get ready to go to bed. He washed his face and he brushed his teeth. But he had one of those old-fashioned medicine cabinet mirrors on his wall, the kind that has a mirror in front. And so he said he had finished washing his face and brushing his teeth, and he opened the medicine cabinet, opened the mirrored front, the door, put his toothbrush and toothpaste away. And Wendy says bourbon, not warm milk. Yeah, I agree. And he put his toothbrush and toothpaste away, and then he closed the mirrored front of the medicine cabinet. And guess what was standing behind him in his reflection? Anyone? I don't see any comments. The man from the Killing Tree was standing there, his neck crooked at an unnatural angle, his eyes were bugged out, his tongue was swollen and stuck out. And of course, Roscoe, he spun around to see what was behind him, and of course nothing was there. But Roscoe, poor old 93-year-old guy, he was all jacked up now. Adrenaline was flowing, so he couldn't go to sleep. So he went back to the kitchen, made some more warm milk, and hey, Pat, and took him another hour before he calmed down, and he finally was getting tired, so he thought he's probably safe, so he went to his bed, he jumped in, drew the covers up over himself, and started to doze. But all of a sudden, he said he had a weird feeling. The room was starting to get cold, and he started to smell something, like a strange sulfurous smell. And all of a sudden, he had a weird feeling like someone was watching him. And he turned his head to the side, to his bedside table, and who was standing there next to his bed? Yes, the man from the killing tree. He was kind of standing like that, his arms down at his side, his neck kind of crooked at an unnatural angle, his eyes were bugged out, his tongue was swollen and stuck out. And poor old Roscoe, he didn't know what to do. He just pulled the covers up over his head and he prayed for this thing to go away. And he fell asleep like that under the covers, praying for this thing to go away. Well, he woke up the next morning and everything was fine. There was nothing there. But he knew that this thing from the killing tree, the man from the killing tree, had followed him home. So he had a friend at the Presbyterian church nearby. So he went to the church the next morning and asked his friend if he would come and kind of do a prayer of blessing over the place, because he knew he had to do something to rid the house of this unwanted visitor. And of course, his friend was fine. He came and did whatever Presbyterians do. I don't think they do holy water, but he said a prayer and kind of cleansed the place. And that was that. As far as he knew, Roscoe said he didn't have any more problems after that. He said, Roscoe, by the way, said after that he never returned to the fountain where the man from the killing tree was said to haunt. And he died 3 years later, Roscoe. He was 96 years old when he died. And from that point on, he never went back to his favorite place where the fountain was, where the bench was, where he would spend every night for an hour or two listening to the water tinkling at the fountain. What's interesting, though, about this story is when I heard this from Roscoe, and I heard another guy in the neighborhood tell me something similar, I started doing more research, and that's when I found out the stuff I was telling you, about the lynchings and things. There were no documented cases of lynchings happening in Louisville, but I did make some interesting discoveries. I found out that even though there were no documented cases of lynchings at the tree, it was a very well-known spot for people to come and commit suicide, and usually by hanging. And in 1933, a local neighborhood newspaper called the Neighborhood Reporter wrote an article about a young man who lived nearby. His family was one of the owners of a house on Floral Terrace. He had gone to the track, squandered his life savings betting on the horses, and he was so devastated by wasting all his money that he came back to where the tree had stood, because it does turn out there was a huge tree there. There was a huge cottonwood tree. They removed it to put the fountain that's there today, and he took out a pistol, and the young guy shot himself in the head. And so already in 1933, that was a place that was documented as a place for suicide. And the reason he went there is because in 1933 already, that was the place in the neighborhood where people knew that you went to go commit suicide. So when I found that article, I did a little more research, and I found 6 other cases of suicides taking place at that tree. And the most famous case of all happened in June of 1901, and it involved a man by the name of Sam Turner. Sam Turner was a black man who lived just a block away on the other side of 7th Street. And what happened is he had been arrested, Sam Turner, because he was involved in a lottery scheme. And back, 100 years ago, lotteries were different. And so I guess this was like an illegal operation. But he had been arrested. He was summoned to go to the magistrate, which he did. And the magistrate said the next morning he was to turn himself in and go to jail and do his time. Well, Sam Turner didn't want
anything to do with this. So the night of June 28th or June 27th, I forget which it is, it was a very hot, sultry night. He grabbed a length of rope and he left his tenement house on 7th Street, crossed over 7th Street into Floral Terrace, and he knew where the hanging tree was. He climbed all the way up to the highest branch that he could reach, and he tied one end of the rope around the branch he was on, the other end around his neck, and he jumped. And the next day, 5 o'clock in the morning, a milkman making deliveries to the families on Floral Terrace saw his body dangling up in the branches 40 feet up. And they said between 500 and 1,000 people turned out to watch them take down the body. It took all day to get up high enough to get people to be able to remove the body. And the funny thing is, when I talked to Roscoe, I took notes. It turns out the night he was sitting at the fountain when he saw the apparition of the man from the killing tree was the night of June 27th, 2001, exactly 100 years to the date from the time that Sam Turner committed suicide. And Sam Turner is just one of the 7 cases of suicides I have found documented that took place at this tree. And it was written about in several local newspapers. Here's one of the pictures that the Louisville Times drew. The illustrator actually drew a picture of him in the branches, and it says, Sam Turner's suicide in a treetop. So this is from June 1901, the Louisville Times. And the funny thing is, lynching probably was a thing in Louisville back then, because one of the other newspapers on June 29th, when they found the body, this was the headline. And Sam Turner, by the way, was black. Hanged himself in a treetop. At first they thought it was a lynching. So chances are, even though lynchings officially didn't take place in Louisville, chances are there probably was a lynching or two that took place there. So on the daily walking tours I give during the evening and at night, we usually go around the St. James Court area, and then we end up going through Fountain Court. It's a really beautiful area. It's one of the hidden gems of old Louisville. Like I said, people live down there for years. They have no idea that walking court is there. Like I said, it's between 7th and 6th Street, bounded by Ormsby Avenue and Park Street. So if you ever get a chance, walk down there. They got beautiful lanterns at night. The neighbors there are really great. Probably don't want me to send too many people walking down there because it's like a little secluded area. But if you ever get a chance, go down and check it out. And I always recommend going down there at night, hanging out at the fountain, and if you hear a branch creaking or something like that, see what happens. Recently, I've talked to people who said they've seen the man from the killing tree, so it seems his ghost still persists. So, like I said, that's one of my favorite stories in the neighborhood, because I've talked to so many people who say they've seen this ghost, and because I found so many historical references to kind of back this up. Like I said, we can't prove that lynchings took place at this tree, but we can prove that a number of suicides took place there. So, not surprising, there might be a ghost lingering around. So, Mike says he's going to have nightmares. Now, good. That's what I like to do. So, those are the stories for tonight. Tomorrow night, tune in, because what's going to happen is, from now on, for the next 2-3 weeks, I don't know how long we're going to be in this, but I'm just going to tune in every night at 9 o'clock, and I'm going to tell stories. So like I said, I'll tell the stories from this book until they run out, and then after that, I'll pull out Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, and I'll just read you a bedtime story every night, 20 or 30 pages of my memoir about my time in old Louisville and the spooky house I used to live in. So, thanks for tuning in tonight. By the way, if you haven't had a chance, check out our new website, LouisvilleHistoricTours.com. My friend Sean Stafford He did great work. Hunley Media is his company. He totally redesigned the website, and of course we need people to be able to make it function. But we're hoping in a month or two, when things are back up and running, we got lots of tourists, you can come and check us out. But you can see where we got our tickets. We got some merchandise available. We're going to be doing a whole line of merchandise promoting Old Louisville as America's most haunted neighborhood, America's most exuberant neighborhood, America's grandest neighborhood. So Charles is asking if there's going to be an event invite. I will try to send reminders, but unless something happens for the next 2-3 weeks, expect me at 9 o'clock Eastern time every night, checking in live, and I'll be telling stories. So hopefully we can all look back on this, and we can think about the time we bonded over spooky stories, and we kind of hung in there together. So I hope you're all doing well. Like I said, my friend Sean Stafford, he did such great work on my website, Louisville Historic Tours. There's a blog thing there. I'll be giving updates on the blog. You can see some merchandise. The merchandise is slowly rolling out, but my friend Carrie Sweet, who is a great designer in the neighborhood, she's helping us. She's the one that did the new logo for us and the new brochure. But we're going to get a whole line of merchandise out promoting Old Louisville as America's most haunted neighborhood, America's grandest Victorian neighborhood, America's, most exuberant neighborhood, and also weird and wonderful Old Louisville. That's another marketing niche we're going after. By the way, I don't know if you knew this, but Louisville is known as Glitterball City. Anyone know why we're known as Glitterball City? If you don't worry, because I'll be telling you about it in upcoming stories, and especially when we read Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa and talk about my current true crime story about the house in Old Louisville, which is where a grisly murder happened in 2009, and that will be another of the stories I tell in the next week or so, and that will probably take a whole hour or so. So most of the time I'm doing 2 stories every session, but there'll be a couple where I just need one story to take up the whole time. So the house in Old Louisville will probably be one of them, and then tomorrow night when we tune in, I'll be telling you the story about the Widmer house where I used to live. So if you see Josh and Sarah Wade, like I said, they're the new owners of the Widmer house. Tomorrow night, all my peeps from the Thursday night dinner club need to check in, or as it was known at one time, the Monday night dinner club, the Tuesday night dinner club, and they all know what this is all about. So tomorrow night, 9 o'clock, check in, and we're going to talk about the place where I used to live. So thanks for coming out tonight. It was good to see you all. Have another bourbon before I go to bed. Hang in there, and I'm glad you checked in. So thank you very much. Love you all, and see you soon. Bye-bye. I'll show you the ceiling of the Magic Library before y'all tune out. Okay? Good night.